Hello, everyone. I am Behruz Qamari Tabrizi. I'm the director of the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center for Iran and Persian Gulf Studies at Princeton University. Welcome to our Wednesday webinar. Before we start, I would like to extend my thanks to Becky Parnian, our events coordinator, and Pete Novak, our IT guru, who has been helping us to make these webinars available to all of our audiences. Before we start, a few words of logistics. The entire conversation today would be 1 hour, and our guest would present his work for around 40 minutes, 40 minutes. We're not sticklers to time here, but somewhere around that time. And after which I will open the screen for your questions. You can submit your questions through the Q&A button on the right side, at the bottom of right side of your screen. I would read your questions and pose them to our speaker. And our speaker today is my colleague and friend here at the center, our own Naveed Mansoori, who is a postdoctoral research associate at the Sharmin and Bijan Mossavar-Rahmani Center at Princeton University. Dr. Mansoori is a political theorist interested in media, religion, and dissent, focusing on the intellectual history of modern Iran. He received his PhD in political science from the University of California in Los Angeles, and currently is working on a book manuscript tentatively called After Prophecy, Propaganda and the Politics of Truth in Contemporary Iran. The book begins with the Shia intellectuals in the interwar period who popularized a narrative of decline where modernity signaled the culminating end of the prophetic tradition. Shia intellectuals saw in propaganda the potential to revive prophecy. The book project tracks the afterlife of this discourse through the 1979 Islamic Revolution and the founding of the Islamic Republic all the way up to 2009 Green Movement. In an article he published recently in the journal Theory and Events, entitled Things Unheard, Popular Silence and the Popular Voice in Revolutionary Iran, he theorizes the silent and shared collectivity that later erupts in noisy rebellion against the Pahlavi state. Mansoori is also the co-editor of Jadaliya's Iran page online. He has also published work in comparative Islamic studies and in society and space. He's also co-editing a handbook on the lived experience of ideology for the Routledge handbooks on political ideologies, practices, and interpretations book series. From 2017 to 2019, Naveed held the Elahe Omidyar Mir Jalili's Fellowship for Excellence in Persian Studies. And before coming to Princeton, Naveed was an ACLS Emerging Voices Fellow in the Religion, Race, Democracy Lab at the University of Virginia. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to have my colleague here, Naveed Mansoori, for today's presentation. Welcome, Naveed. You're on mute.
I'm on mute. Thank you so much. So let me share my screen. So thank you so much to Behruz, Becky, Femke, and Pete for everything they do to help the center and for organizing this event. And thank you to everyone who's joined us today. The topic of today's talk is the popular voice conceived as an expression of political faith. In an influential study, the sociologist Jose Casanova sought to make sense of the emergence of public religions after the 1979 revolution in Iran, the Nicaraguan Revolution, and the formation of Solidarity in Poland. There was a curious and surprising resurgence of public religious activity worldwide in North America, Latin America, and the Middle East. The 1980s unsettled conventional narratives of historical progress that predicted that as societies that became increasingly modern, religion would become increasingly relegated to private life. Religious traditions throughout the world, Casanova argued, are refusing to accept the marginal and privatized role which theories of modernity, as well as theories of secularization, have reserved for them. He named that historical progress the deprivatization of religion. The private and public spheres that Casanova speaks to are both categories of the modern state. Here, the state is conceived as a necessary foregrounding principle for the security of subjects and citizens, and likewise as the privileged vector for decisions that bear upon the destiny of the community. To that end, in the private sphere, we are inactive. We become active when we enter into and participate within the marketplace of ideas or civil society, a space in which members of the community can speak and be heard by the state, or so the story goes. These categories are foundational to the narrative that in the 1980s, religion was deprivatized, that the emergence of public religion was a moment when religion broke the seal of silence. If we take the state as the beginning and end of politics, it is easy to conclude that non-participation in state matters is a sign of political inactivity or political apathy. Behavioralist scholars of political apathy have suggested that in healthy democracies, political apathy is actually good for democracy. Samuel Huntington suggested that it would alleviate pressure from government machinery. In Time magazine, Charles Krauthammer praised the non-voter, arguing that low voter turnout was indication of popular satisfaction with the state. In this literature, non-participation is defined in relation to government machinery. But political activity is, of course, so much more than participation in formal institutions. It includes the many things that we feel, think, say, and do that are concerned with shaping the conditions of collective life. We can think of political activity in that more capacious sense. Our formal political institutions at best regulate politics. At worst, they co-opt political activity broadly conceived for the aims, ends, and interests of elite who derive from them the mere semblance of political legitimacy. During crises of legitimacy, these registers of politics, formal institutions on the one hand, and the work of shaping the conditions of collective life on the other are rent apart. I want to expand upon Casanova's study by attending to the historicity of privacy and publicity in Iran, where formal political institutions were either absent or widely perceived as illegitimate, as a way of reimagining the relation between non-participation and participation in politics. Here I attend to the relation between privacy and publicity, a relation that coordinates with political silence, or the real and perceived silence of the people and the voice of the people. I will focus on the indeterminacy, or the fundamental ambiguity of the silence of the people, that is, the way in which non-participation posed the question, who is not engaging in politics and why? I suggest that what is conventionally viewed as political apathy is non-participation from the administrative point of view. I will consider non-participation in formal institutions as insubordination, teasing out an under-theorized aspect of political silence as tacit disagreement rather than tacit consent, to reflect on how such a reframing of non-participation bears upon the narrative that in the 1980s with the Islamic revival, religion began to play a role in politics. This talk focuses on the legitimation crisis after the 1953 coup of Mohammad Mossadegh, with specific focus on the relation between political media and the popular voice. The first section documents the state's efforts to develop and expand radio, the voice of the nation, and locates its early history in the context of the state's efforts to silence its opposition. The second section turns to clandestine radio stations, left opposition's preferred medium for remaining politically engaged despite physical and political alienation from formal political institutions. Political alienation compelled opposition to abandon the state and focus on political activity that was legible as non-participation from the standpoint of the state. The third section examines reflections on political silence and intellectual culture in the mid to late 1960s. That section situates Khomeini's call in 1971 to boycott the 2,500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire and the circulation of that call with cassette in the context of reflections on political silence. Overall, I show how political silence can become activated as a real and perceived strike against politics. It is well-documented history that the Pahlavi state rigged elections after the 1953 coup. In the 1954 elections for the 18th Majlis, Prime Minister Zahedi had some leverage over the process, though met resistance from the Shah. In the 1956 elections for the 19th Majlis, deputized authorities had the power to curate the list of possible candidates, while local officials switched out ballot boxes or declared winners while concealing how many votes were cast. In those elections, per the Majlis, some people refused to vote as a means of passive resistance. In the meanwhile, the Pahlavi state mobilized its resources to engineer the voice of the people. Formal political institutions, here parliament and elections, were to be mediums of the popular voice to regulate politics by providing a legitimate outlet for its self-expression. The Pahlavi state had a prior concern, a real and perceived crisis of faith in its political legitimacy, or in other words, anxiety and insecurity that the silence of the people was not a sign of political agreement. In its efforts to cultivate the popular voice, the state both tried to assemble a national audience and inversely to cultivate the perceptual habits of its audiences by training their ears. To capture that effort and its limits, I focus on state-run radio, the amplifier of the Pahlavi state. I frame the state's efforts to develop radio infrastructure in the context of electoral interference, and more broadly, in the context of the state's deployment of its repressive and ideological arms. The seizure of state power in the 1953 coup was a contested affair. The Pahlavi state invested in securing its status as the legitimate representative of the voice of the people on two fronts. It did so, on the one hand, by silencing its opposition. From 1953 to 1957, the Pahlavi state arrested a little over 4,000 members of the Tudeh Communist Party. The Tudeh Party was the Pahlavi state's foremost opposition in the past decade. After the state's dragnet, the party was effectively dismantled. The repressive state apparatus had worked as intended. On the other hand, the state secured that status with propaganda, that is, with the ideological state apparatus. Until 1953, state actors did not have an opportunity to utilize radio with full force. Reza Shah Pahlavi introduced radio to Iran in 1940. The first transmission, the national anthem, set the tone for radio's mission. The newspaper Ittilat celebrated the new technology as the voice of the nation heard in different parts of the world. Reza Shah's tenure ended the next year, however. Mossadeq used radio to compel his public to participate in politics. He was able to call on them to amass in the streets during the nationalization campaign. After the 1953 coup, the Pahlavi state invested in expanding and developing radio infrastructure. The state sought to establish that the voice of the state echoed the national voice. The Shah sent the director of Radio Tehran, Bahram Bushehripur, to Gilan, Mazandaran, and Gorgan in March 1954 to discuss opening propaganda departments and radio stations with governors. Radio Tehran was enlisted in silencing communists by means of amplifying the voice of the nation. The Minister of Posts and Telegraph stated that Radio Tehran would aid in the hard fight against the pessimistic propaganda of its opponents and antagonists. In February 1955, the supervisor of the Publication and Propaganda Department stated, government propaganda media, including radio service, strives to safeguard Iranian racial character. The expansion and development of radio infrastructure coincided with the state-led effort in 1954 and 1956 to manufacture the electoral process, that is, to determine what the popular voice expressed. The state encountered two limits to the ideological state apparatus. The first limit was infrastructural. The material basis for the popular voice captured by the state was not given. It had to be built from scratch, otherwise it would remain a state fantasy. In December 1956, the US gave Iran a radio transmitter. Radio Tehran eventually began broadcasting with a 100 kilowatt transmitter, powerful enough to reach Qom, but not nearly powerful enough to reach Isfahan. Regardless, with newfound means and ambitions to expand, the state renamed Radio Tehran to Radio Iran. By 1959, the Pahlavi state had built transmitters in the capitals of 10 provinces. The state was aggressive in these efforts. In August 1959, the Minister of Agriculture expropriated land in Karaj for a radio tower to fulfill the propaganda needs of the country, while the state commissioned transmitters in Gordan and Zahedan. As radio infrastructure expanded Radio Iran's reach, so too the number of radio sets increased. By 1965, there were an estimated 2 million radio sets in Iran with an audience of 10 million. The second limit was aural. The audience was not a passive recipient of information. In 1959, Radio Iran engaged in sonic warfare with Radio Moscow. That episode was incited by Nikita Khrushchev, who had claimed that Iran posed a threat to the USSR's national security. By 1960, the USSR began to jam Radio Iran's broadcasts. Crucially, a broadcast cutting out, resulting in white noise, could have plausibly signaled weak infrastructure. Reza Shah and Mohammad Reza Shah had developed and expanded radio as a monument to Iran's status as a modern country. So content notwithstanding, the clarity of radio transmissions was communicating Iran's progress. Radio static was a blank slate for the sonic imagination. In August 1960, Radio Iran played a sample of a broadcast cutting out. The listener hears the Soviet station jamming Radio Iran, a commentator stated. This has usually been noticed on several occasions at news time by the people in the provinces, and the people have asked, what is this? Now I will tell them what this is. This is the work of a station that lies to the world. The state was trying to cultivate the perceptual habits of its audiences, to train their ears to hear noise as foreign meddling in Iran's affairs, and to hear sound as a sign of historical progress. The USSR was jamming Radio Iran signals. That is not at all a point of dispute here, but the fundamental ambiguity or indeterminacy of noise was an issue for the state. That was so by virtue of an audience that could be listening in a way that disagreed with its aims and ends. In the next section, I turn to clandestine radio. I suggest that the political and physical displacement of clandestine radio stations reflected the opposition's political alienation. I examine a 5-year period from 1958 to 1963 when the opposition called for political reforms. That period provided a short-lived lesson concerning the limits of formal political institutions. The Tudeh party made use of shortwave radio throughout the 1950s. The party used transmitters within Tehran to broadcast messages across the city's soundscapes. On April 14, 1956, Radio Iran boasted that the Savak, the Pahlavi state's domestic and foreign intelligence agency, was in the process of annihilating the leadership machinery of the Tudeh party and the party's activities. Tehran's military governor, Colonel Mobasser, had discovered a printing plant and seized a number of party books, documents, and some issues of the party organ Mardom. The municipal security forces confiscated all copies of the last issue of the paper Mardom dated back at the beginning of March. They pressed onward. They shut down smaller printing presses in a larger printing plant on April 10th. They then arrested party leader Nureddin Kiadnuri, who supervised the larger printing plant, along with a few others, creating the possibility for the final destruction of what remains of the Tudeh party. The then named Radio Tehran also mentioned that security forces discovered that the party decided to set up a radio station to contact foreigners and to broadcast poisonous propaganda. The party had stolen a transmitter from the army. The spokesman displayed the stolen transmitter for the audience. In the late 1950s, the Tudeh party established a clandestine radio station, Peke Iran, in East Berlin. One of their first broadcasts was a response to the Pahlavi state's decision to change Radio Tehran to Radio Iran. Does the broadcasting service speak for the people of Iran, or is it the radio of the very same persons who have deprived the people of their rights, they asked. There's no doubt that in the present world, radio plays a great role in building public opinion. At any rate, radio is like a flame which can both light and burn a house. Radio may become either a misleading center or a media for public opinion in defense of the rights of the people. In tandem with Peke Iran, from Soviet Azerbaijan, the national voice of Iran, or Sedaya Milli Iran, began broadcasting in spring 1959. NVOI was most likely established by the more leftist members of the National Front, the umbrella organization the ousted Mossadegh organized and spearheaded in 1951. NVOI lambasted radio's anti-Soviet propaganda. Radio Iran has embarked on a Cold War, so to speak, and has become a tub thumper for American anti-Soviet propaganda. No one will swallow this. The nation can distinguish its friends from its foes. They concluded, the Iranian propaganda machinery is no longer held by us. It belongs to American colonialists. Despite non-participation in the elections for the 19th Majlis, the state's opposition remained invested in electoral and parliamentary politics, even from abroad. Mohammad Reza Shah dissolved parliament in May 1961 and appointed Adi Amini as prime minister. Meanwhile, the National Front demanded the state release Mossadegh from house arrest and reappoint him. In the summer of 1961, the memory of the 1953 coup was contested on Tehran streets. The National Front planned a demonstration in Jalaliya Square on July 21st, 1961, or the 30th of Tir, to protest the coup d'etat. The 30th of Tir was the anniversary of mass protests in 1952 that were opposed to the state's decision to remove Mossadegh from power. Those security forces responded aggressively. Those protests resulted with the Shah temporarily reinstating him. The Pahlavi state enforced a ban on the July 1961 demonstrations. The National Front defied the ban regardless. Radio Iran tuned in to the national voice of Iran, blaming NVOI for the demonstrations. A week after the demonstration, NVOI stated, following the brilliant victory of the national forces of Iran on the 30th of Tir, the coup d'etat propaganda apparatus has concentrated its attention on what it calls the foreign radios. From Arsanjani to Amini, and from Ittilat to London Radio, they have formed a single front to say that these foreign radios are to blame for all that has happened. When the people hear the voice of the national voice, they feel that this is their own voice. This belongs to the people who have grown up on the dirt streets of Tehran. When they hear the national voice, they feel the pains and sufferings of the heroic nation and its struggles against imperialism. This is why they listen to this radio, and do not listen to national radio. One must not forget that the National Front has not been able to yet have a party newspaper, the commentator continued. In this suppressive atmosphere, one has to resort to other means to voice one's opinion. And they concluded, the Tudeh Party of Iran, which it found it impossible to express its views freely, found other means, such as Radio Peki-Iran. This is natural. The Tudeh Party of Iran had this right, for there was no possibility for working openly in Iran. The Pahlavi state planned a counter-demonstration that would fall on August 17th or the 28th of Mordad, the day of the coup. On August 15th, PAIQ broadcast their criticism. What is the aim of this plan? It is to show that the Shah has many followers among the public and that his regime is popularly based. What is the need for all these lies? The reason, the public unrest, the publication of truth by the press and the public serving radios, and several similar things have exposed the Shah's frail position to international circles. Radio Iran was listening. On August 17th, they remarked on a very strange event. The enemies of Iran were broadcasting from East Berlin. The fact is that on the morning of the 28th of Mordad, conditions were such that the illegal Tudeh Party, under the assurances which it has been given, planned to set up a so-called people's democracy. The Pahlavi state's claim did not sit well with the voices PAIQ and NVOI amplified. Without elections or a parliament, opposition voiced themselves by other means. On January 21st, 1962, students at the University of Tehran protested the Pahlavi state's ongoing refusal to hold elections or to reassemble the parliament. Mohammad Reza Shah approved a crackdown. The police intervened with abandon. On January 23rd, NVOI addressed the felony perpetrated against the university students and called for an uprising against the British Amini cabinet. Compatriots, honorable Iranians and sons of the homeland, they declared, Tehran has risen in struggle. The voices of the fighters from Tabriz, Shiraz, Mashhad, Rasht, Abadan, and all Iranian cities should join those of the Tehran fighters. By late 1962, the Shah appointed Asadullah Alam as prime minister. He promised that soon there would be elections. PAIQ saw the call for elections as a ruse. They called for struggle against these cheap parasites with our full force and all available means. On November 12th, they explained that the Shah had held off elections because he might not be able to have a parliament that suits him and the foreign supporters of his regime. All the claims made by Alam about the so-called stability of the Shah's regime, they continued, the improvement of financial conditions and so forth, are nonsense and groundless. The Shah's regime is afflicted with a chronic crisis that cannot be cured with medicine. PAIQ stated that free elections were impossible in Iran because there were no political freedoms or the freedom to organize political parties. On January 26, 1963, the state held a referendum on the White Revolution, its central initiative, land reform. The referendum was to prove that the Pahlavi state had the confidence of the people. The National Front boycotted the referendum. PAIQ gave voice to that dissatisfaction. Despite the propagandists and the trumpets of the regime, PAIQ declared on January 28th, this referendum not only did not make any political capital for the Shah's regime, but on the contrary, it proved to the world the poverty of a dictatorial and tyrannical rule. They continued, a regime which collects votes through the force of the bayonet and by suppressing the people's freedom can never pretend to be supported by the people. Beginning in 1964, the call to arms was answered in an inverted form as the opposition to monarchy began to organize in silence. 1964 saw the formation of the Fedayeen and the Mujahideen. The Tudeh Party insisted on a peaceful transition, keeping in line with the CPSU. But with the Sino-Soviet split, an emergent collectivity of left opposition tuned in to criticism of the Soviet line. From 1965 to 1967, Mehdi Khan Baba Tehrani ran a Farsi language program on Beijing radio at 7 and 9 p.m. local time in Iran. From Beijing, he would read aloud the works of Mao Zedong. The noted revolutionary Abbas Miftahi would then record and transcribe the broadcasts. These broadcasts introduced Mao's thought in Iran and coincided with the circulation of clandestine leaflets and pamphlets, including the political works of Che Guevara, Uruguay's Tupamaros, and Brazil's Marighella. In the next section, I place political silence in the wake of the June 1963 uprisings protesting the White Revolution and the Shah more broadly, in the context of a general disillusionment with formal political institutions after the boycott of the January referendum, and also in the context of a tactical shift from vocal criticism of the state to clandestine organizing. So doing, I attend to the somewhat counterintuitive way in which silence was made to speak, or less poetically, the way in which non-participation became an expression of insubordination. There's a conventional narrative that after the June 1963 uprisings, there was silence until December 1978 with the mass demonstrations that culminated with the 1979 revolution. That period coincided with the so-called Long Night of Labor, Fred Halliday's formulation to describe the curious and much debated absence of labor organizing following the 1953 coup. In autumn 1963, the noted cleric Mortaza Motahari, along with a few others, finished building and finally established the Hosseiniya Ershad, a religious and cultural institute that quickly became one of the more popular venues for reformist Shias to deliver political oratory. On 3 occasions, Motahari had delivered sermons on Radio Iran. He was standing in for Hossein Ali Rashid, a cleric who delivered sermons every Friday for an hour for 35 years. Motahari and Rashid arrived at contending visions for the possibilities radio afforded them. Rashid was a member of parliament in the early 1950s, while he also featured on radio. On September 28, 1952, Rashid resigned from parliament. If you remember, during the past 10 to 11 years that I have been speaking over Radio Tehran, I have always tried to put into your minds the spirit of liberalism. Media did not report on his speeches. Why should I go to such a parliament? I have not made the statement in parliament because it would be official and would appear in the papers. But now I am saying this because it is between ourselves. For Rashid, radio provided him a medium to serve as a voice for the people that parliament did not. On the third and last occasion, Motahari spoke on radio. He grew wary of doing so since, in his words, delivering religious sermons by way of an instrument of oppression is not right. Motahari's cynicism about radio was echoed by Jalal Ola Ahmad in his 1961 monograph, Gharbzadagi, or West-strickenness. The thesis of his monograph is and was widely known. The absence of direct colonial intervention regardless, Iran was colonized from within. He claimed that the people of Iran had lost sight of what they cared about and why they cared. They were psychologically and politically alienated. In his words, they were standing on thin air. In the conclusion of his monograph, Ola Ahmad provides a cynical critique of the ideological state apparatus's effect on Iranians. That apparatus was cause for their melancholy, the emotion that attends psychological and political alienation, the feeling that attends a lack. In the 1961 edition, Ola Ahmad speaks to the effect that Radio Iran had on Iranians. Every day on radio, Ola Ahmad claimed, the Pahlavi state constructed a new and imaginary enemy and propagandized to instill fear in the people and sell them despair and bribe them of any force they have. One day, there was the discovery of a network of the Tudeh party, a reference to a broadcast I spoke to above. The next, a war against opium, then a war against heroin, then the case of Bahrain, then the war with Iraq, and in short, that which fills the ears. In 1964, following the June 1963 uprisings, Ola Ahmad revised his monograph. He made his most significant revision to the passage above. Something had clearly changed. Ola Ahmad's cynicism gives way to hopefulness about the limits of the ideological state apparatus. In the revised monograph, Ola Ahmad suggests that radio glorified the national past. More crucially, he introduces a character who has the capacity to make his own noise. Ola Ahmad writes, "Have you seen how a tired young worker walks down a lonely lane on a dark night? He generally sings to himself because he is afraid to be alone. He fills his own ears with his voice and thus dispels his fear. The radio fulfills the very same function. You hear it on everywhere just to make some noise." The young worker lives in his own world. The Hosseiniya Ershad occupied a similarly liminal position. It was not a property of civil society simply by virtue of being a non-governmental establishment, since to call something non-governmental suggests that it is defined by its relation to the state. It would be akin to saying that the tired young worker singing to himself at night was being unproductive, that the silence he was filling with his voice was the lost potential for socially productive sound. Mutahari suggested that content aside, any broadcast over state-run radio, even his own religious sermons, was determined by the state, or rather, that the state filled the silence. In Mutahari's undialectical way of thinking, the Hosseini Ershad was not non-governmental. It was indifferent to government. Yet, it was politically and perceptually a property of the state. It was its own thing, as Mutahari insisted upon, but it also meant something to the Pahlavi state. Ali Shariati, popularly known as the ideologue of the Islamic Revolution, was one of the more popular speakers at the Hosseiniya Ershad. In the late 1960s, he gained popularity after taking a lecture tour across the country. The Savak banned him from speaking publicly. He spent a year in silence, during which time he penned reflections grieving his solitude. On December 1st, 1969, he delivered a lecture at the Hosseiniya Ershad titled Ali is Alone. He reflected on his own silence in the past year by way of a reflection on his namesake, the Imam Ali. He addressed the Prophet's appeal to Ali that he remained silent under the rule of Abu Bakr. Shariati's lecture had multiple references: his own silence in the past year, the silence of the clerics, and the silence of his compatriots who bit their tongues by whim and by force. Shariati opened his lecture by speaking to the liminality of the Hosseiniya Ershad, reframing the terms of opposition as political silence as such and the struggle to represent it. To begin, distinguished participants, ladies and gentlemen, I must make an apology, two apologies. The first apology, I am standing in a position from which I must speak about Ali, and this is the apex of embarrassment and inability. The second apology is that I'm not an orator, I am not a lecturer, I am a simple teacher, and without my wanting it, my tone is the tone of a teacher in the classroom. The silence of Ali, the expression of non-participation, was indeterminate. In speaking with the tone of a teacher, Shariati would unwittingly sound like he knew what he was talking about. He modeled an ethics of listening to silence. The Imam Ali was not consenting to Abu Bakr, just as Ali Shariati did not consent to the state. The Imam's appeal is to us, he stated, and our calling is clear. Recognizing these lessons, singing these words, listening to these silences. Ali's silence made a sound despite not making a noise as positivity in negative garb. Shariati narrativized his non-participation as tacit disagreement to the Pahlavi state without ascribing a reason or a cause for why Ali, so to speak, refused to engage in politics. Just as noise was an issue for Radio Iran, where state-run radio tried to discipline the perceptual habits of its audiences, Silence is here a problem for Shariati. To be clear, I'm not suggesting that we follow Shariati in figuring political silence in Islamic history. Rather, his lecture attests to the indeterminacy of the long night that ended with the day of the revolution and the ethics of listening operative in making sense of silence in the pre-revolutionary period. In the late 1960s, too, a new technology appeared that was convenient for clandestine activity. The cassette entered wide circulation in Iran and soon aided in transmitting both Shariati and Khomeini's lectures. In Roy Motahide's words, many Iranians learned to their delight that they can control the electronic noise in their lives. Taxis had cassettes continuously playing, and entrepreneurs, unencumbered by copyright, duplicated cassettes in the thousands. 1971 is well known as the year when the seal of silence was broken. The Fedayeen opened fire against the Savak in the northern province of Siyahkal, a living example of what the Fedai theoretician Bijan Jazani named armed propaganda. But so too, in the same year, the seal of silence was counterintuitively broken with non-participation, with a collective act of refusal. On January 22nd, 1971, Khomeini delivered a sermon in response to the Shah's plans for the 2500-year anniversary of the Persian Empire later that year. The Iranian nation, Khomeini professed, is responsible for a negative protest of this celebration, not positive. It is not necessary. They ought not leave their homes during these celebrations to not partake in them. With negative protests, he continued, his audience would break the seal of silence. This counterintuitive formulation recalls the lesson Shariati attested to learning from Ali. The seal of silence was not broken with vocal criticism, but with a refusal to engage in politics, or rather, a refusal of formal institutions and a decentering of the state as the lodestone of normative ethics. Khomeini was conceiving non-participation or political apathy from the standpoint of the state as refusal. He was trying to make silence speak, to make a sound without making a noise. One Naqi Musavi Dorche recalls how he came by a copy of that sermon and his efforts to reproduce it and circulate it to friends and comrades. One of the cassettes reached my hand from someone who went by Masbah. I'm not sure if he brought the cassette from Najaf or who he got it from. In any case, because I didn't have the means to reproduce tapes, some friends reproduced it. After it was reproduced, we covertly sent the cassette of the Imam's speech to every acquaintance who was either in the struggle or who we trusted. Once we'd given the reproduced cassettes to people, we'd say, go knock on the person's door. And if they don't open it, put the cassette in a high quality and secure envelope and hand it to their family. In that way, nobody would find out where the cassette of the Imam's speech was produced and how it got to their hands. So doing, he and his friends circulated the call for a boycott of public life. The next year, Flames of Persia, Shahrukh Golistan's propaganda film about the 2500-year anniversary celebration, was a commercial failure in Tehran. In his astonishing history of Iranian cinema, Hamid Nafisi speculates that, in his words, the major reason for the failure was political, not technical. At this time, the Shah was not very popular, and the forced and massive exposure of this propagandistic film about an event whose extravagant expenditures had become legendary and highly resented was like pouring salt into a wound. I have tried to attest to a circumstance in which we might be compelled to make such a speculation in the face of epistemic uncertainty, and the way that speculation about non-participation does political work. Here, it was not the popular voice, but a popular silence that suggested renewed faith in politics. I have expanded upon Casanova's thesis that in the 1980s, religion became political by becoming public. In the insubordinate soundscapes of 1960s and 70s in Iran, religion was not indifferent to politics. Its retreat from formal institutions betrayed a crisis of confidence. Silence was political apathy or tacit consent from the administrative point of view. That perception is possible when observers view the state as the beginning and end of political life. To the opposition, the sphere of life that the state registered as silent was the genesis of a world. Anticipating the momentous triumph of the revolution on February 11th, 1979, when, off the heels of a months-long strike by the employees of National Iranian Radio and Television, opposition seized the headquarters of NIRT, assumed control of Radio Iran, and declared, "This is the voice of Tehran, the genuine voice of the Iranian nation, the voice of the revolution." Thank you.
Thank you so much, Naveed. This was such a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed listening to you, and there are so many threads that we can follow in this talk, and I want to and again, I reminded that you can submit your questions through the Q&A button on your screen, but as we're waiting for your questions, I can have this little conversation of my own with Naveed. I wonder if you thought of, instead of thinking about silent in terms of dissent or consent, how could you think, or what would be your response to if we think of silence as ambivalence?
Yeah, right.
Because it's really difficult to, as you can imagine that it's very hard to then define the meaning of silence exactly because of its silence, so why don't you look at it as ambivalence rather than dissent or consent?
Sure, thank you. So I think the way I try to frame it is that silence is fundamentally ambiguous. That, for example, if we were to look empirically at why people don't vote, you'll find a lot of reasons. Maybe someone just didn't wake up in time, or was sick, or whatever, and didn't make it to the voting booth. What I'm interested in here is the way that the speculation becomes a political and historical force. The moment where in 2016, there was a running joke that the winner of the 2016 elections in the United States were non-voters. That if you actually looked at how many votes Trump and Clinton got, you would see that non-voters, eligible voters who didn't vote, outnumbered the number of people who voted for those candidates. So people were sitting there and being like, see, this is a sign that people aren't participating. Now, of course, empirically, that may be false. It's a fiction, but I'm interested in the fiction. So in these moments where someone might sit there and say, well, is it the case that people who didn't go see, for example, Hamid Nafizi, is it the case that when people didn't go see Flames of Persia, that they were doing so with a political motivation? It might not be the case at all. But the speculation, I think, had a life that, right, there was a kind of way in which there was the imagination or the imaginary idea that people were not participating because they were refusing the state, I think became a meme almost. It became popularized. And so the fundamental ambiguity is conceptually prior to the way in which the speculation about that, the preponderance of the object ends up doing work in historical and political life.
So in a sense, you're reading this silence through the way it's reflected in the commentary of the observers,
Right.
So then, because that's also a fascinating issue, because obviously, there are two different ways one can approach this. One is that it's kind of a late 19th century, mid 19th century kind of question of political legitimacy, and in the way that kind of a Bismarckian kind of attempt to bring in the population into the fold of political authority, right? And the fact that even Bismarck thought of having a newspaper, but obviously the objective is to bring in the populace into the fold of political authority, and in a sense, in a kind of an authoritarian way, to sort of establish an ideological state apparatus when the repressive apparatus is not enough to legitimize the authority, right? And but there is also somewhere that we see this shift, and I like the quotations that you brought in from Claude Hammer and Huntington, that sort of disenfranchisement of the populace becomes an evidence of democratic operation, you know, like, and of course, radio in Iran has that kind of status. The intention was to bring that Bismarckian, bringing the populace into the fold of political authority as, you know, subjects who are participating in governance, you know. And so here you're highlighting the failure of that project, right? And and the way there is a refusal, but that refusal is expressed in the silence that you identify as the expression of that, or as manifestation of that failure.
Right.
So I mean, it might not be a question, but I'm trying to sort of unpack what you're saying into sort of my own way of understanding your argument there. And but silence itself, I mean, I'm in my own work, I'm really interested in silence, because silence has so many different ways of expressing ideas. And the question is, how do you get access to that silence, the meaning of that silence? Or is it possible at all to have such access outside of the way it's reflected in the commentary of the observers of silence? You know?
Yeah, and I think the way in which it's sort of because it's not an analytic category that I'm posing. It's language that I'm trying to draw out of the archive. And I think the way in which conceptually the sort of it's schematized, and there is a sort of implicit architectonic where silence is a thing that cannot be understood. And the way in which that sort of conception of a sort of conceptual hierarchy, where the preponderant, the object that cannot be mastered is silence, you know, in sort of like a Sufi sense, like the silence of God, right? Or even the way in which Shadiati speaks to it too, where he's like, you can, like, this is the apex of my embarrassment and inability, because you are asking me to give an answer as to the meaning of Adi's silence. By virtue of the topic, I cannot actually provide knowledge. Mm-hmm. And then he takes that and runs with it in that lecture. And so that's just sort of, I wouldn't like fully ascribe to that architectonic and conceptual hierarchy, but I'm interested in a sort of reconstructing internally the way the systematization of these concepts, and then to see how by privileging silence as this thing that can never be heard, it ends up doing a kind of work. Of course, there's, you know, John Cage as well, who says like there is no such thing as silence. There's always something that makes a sound.
Yeah. No, of course. I mean, the silence is, it's such a fascinating topic. Let me pose to you this question from my colleague Satya Larson. It's a follow-up on the first question on the question of sort of dissent and consent, and she's asking. So if you look at the question of silence in those binary terms, does it seem like you're articulating politics in a sort of a Schmittian kind of friend and enemy way? And again, another follow-up on that, what about silence as a behavior reflecting becoming, ambiguity, hesitation, undecidability, or uncertainty, Or is it this binary of silence, something that helps us understand the historical moment in Iran, like a rhetoric of silence means a politics of you must pick a side. For example, you mentioned that white noise on the radio was something unacceptable to state power. So it is just like all, I mean, I think you put your finger on something so crucial, I think, in the way we understand politics, and a way actually to sort of transcend that kind of, with reference to Satiel's comment, Schmittian kind of binary enemy friend, and then silence opens up that space. And how do we then make sense of it?
I think that if the work were ethnographic and I were trying to understand the silent lives of people, that applying a Schmittian sort of heuristic onto the actual and lived experience of silence would be a violent imposition. But what I'm interested in is the circumstance. I'm very much interested in the imagination and speculation. So it seemed like there was a moment, and I was trying to give that account from 58 to 63, where politics was becoming increasingly Schmittian. That there was the sort of way in which there was a sort of Manichaean way in which thinking of state and not state, and the way in which the opposition of political silence as insubordination was becoming more just apparent in the archive and as with the way people were seeing it. So, I mean, in the kind of Fanonian sense where someone asks him, why are you so Manichaean? He's like, I'm not Manichaean, they are, you know. I would say that I think my sort of the way I'm approaching this is that there was a similar moment where perhaps I would say that there was a time where that politics in Iran became very Schmittian, and that political silence became conceptualized within that way. Now, of course, calling it Schmittian is translating and making theory travel in ways I don't know exactly it was, but definitely it was Manichaean. There was, it was like Yazid Hussein, right? Like it was just, you're this or that. And so silence is reflecting, becoming, ambiguity, hesitation, etc. The person who I think is best or most at least explicit in speaking to silence as becoming, but also the way in which, and then an ethics of actually, voicing is Shariati. So for Shariati, the problem that Shariati had when he was in silence was precisely hesitation, undecidability, the moment when he wasn't yet politically engaged, and then in a kind of Lutheran moment becomes resolved, right? Becomes politically resolved and engages and becomes engaged. So right. So the binary to me seems like something that was just happening as the space of the imagination became foreclosed and the state just became enemy. I also, sorry to add, would say that about the way Ola Ahmad critiques the ideological state apparatus. Of course, if you were to listen to radio, it wasn't just fear mongering. Like, was he not listening to like pop music? Like, there was like a lot on radio, but like it betrays the habits and motivations. And, was it like that in fact, the person saying that the ideological apparatus interpolates us as the state is interpolated by the state? It begs the question. And so, anyway, so that's around where I'm thinking.
No, that's. I mean, we are running out of time, but I want to just put a couple of ideas on the table that perhaps we can also rethink the notion of silence if we don't think of politics in terms of the discourse of the state, right? Because there's a lot of things happens in society that is very political, and we shouldn't, I think, only think of the way people relate or not relate to the state as the space of politics, right? So there might not be silence at all, but in terms of only in that space, maybe that there is silence in relation to the state, of course. And these are just ideas that I finish with one anecdote that when they showed the 500th anniversary documentary to the Shah, it is said that the Shah was wondering, oops, there was a little explosion near me. So the Shah's comment was that, well, this is an interesting documentary, but where are the Iranian people in this documentary? So I think he was very much aware of the absence of the people. So anyway, thank you so much, Naveed. This was such an beautifully crafted talk, and so many ideas in there. And so we are in the same building, and we can continue this conversation. If anyone has questions, you can directly email Naveed Mansoori at the Iran Center to Princeton University. And thank you again, Naveed, for this brilliant presentation.
Yeah.
Thank you. Bye-bye now.